And if, we're up to about 75 participants now, and if a few other people join us, that's absolutely fine. So welcome to our webinar on new milestones and culminating tasks. It is part of the pop-up PD for Literacy Educators series. I just would like to note, of course, today that we are recording. We do not have ASL interpreters today. We did have ASL interpreters when we presented this webinar back in October, but we weren't able to secure ASL interpreters today, as Stacy was just describing. My name is Barb Glass. Very nice to be here with you today. I'm the Executive Director of the College Sector Committee for Adult Upgrading, which is the sector support organization for LBS service providers in the colleges. My co-host today is Robin Cook-Ritchie. Many of you know Robin from other webinars and lots of projects over the years. Robin is the Executive Director of LABOC Literacy Ontario. So just as we first get into it, we did want to mention that both of our organizations, the CSC and LABOC Literacy Ontario, were involved in the OALCF Enhancement Initiative last fiscal year, as were most of the other support organizations also involved. And so it was during this initiative last year that the new Milestones and Culminating Tasks were developed. Before we actually get into the presentation, I would just say, if you have a question, you're welcome to type it into the chat. I can see the chat from where I am. Robin can see it. Heather Robinette, who's kind of our moderator today, can also see it. And you're welcome to type something into the chat, and Robin and I will do our best to address it as we go along. So first, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we are on today. We are scattered throughout the province, which is actually wonderful that we can come together today on this virtual platform, but we should take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands that each of us calls home. And of course, we do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of our local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Just very briefly, I'm guessing most of you have attended a pop-up PD session before, but just in case, we always like to start with a little bit of a background about pop-up PD. It is a free webinar series developed by a number of the LBS regional networks and the provincial support organizations. We endeavor to find topics, of course, that support LBS practitioners with relevant, timely PD. We've been doing the English language webinars since 2015-16, and as our colleague from Contact North mentioned a few minutes ago, we are now able to also provide French language transcriptions. They are usually available about 3 weeks after the actual presentation, and we're grateful to COFA for taking on the French translation for us. If you did want to look at previous webinars or access future webinars when they have been posted, you can go to the pop-up PD resources for LBS educators. Sorry, I'm stumbling over that sentence, which is on the main e-channel pop-up PD website. You can Google it and you'll get there as well, recognizing that you can't click on this and just go there from your computer right now. If you do have ideas for webinar topics, we always welcome them. As part of the organizing committee, I would certainly say that we always welcome ideas, and so you're welcome to send a message to echannel@contactnorth.ca. We do have our webinars set for the current fiscal year for 2022-23, but really before long, we'll probably be looking at webinars for 23-24. So once again, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us today. Briefly, I'll just walk you through the agenda. We have kind of 8 buckets or areas to cover today. We'll talk about the development process around those new milestones and culminating tasks, a little bit of a refresher on the origins of milestones, discussion of the new milestones. Then similarly with the culminating tasks, we will have a little refresher about how they originated, discuss the new ones. We'll talk about the repository where they are stored and will eventually be accessible. And then a few best practices around administering milestones and culminating tasks, and what's a good webinar without a what's next section. Robin and I will be taking turns. We're going to switch back and forth a couple of times during the webinar. But again, feel free to post a question in the chat at any point if you wish to. And we will be happy to answer it. I was just looking back at the chat here. I don't see anything yet, so that's great.
Okay, it's my turn to, I think it's my turn to jump in now. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the development timeline overall for milestones and culminating tasks. So they're not something new. They're something that actually we started working on more than 10 years ago. So the original milestones and culminating tasks were made available to the field in around 2012. And that original set included 6 culminating tasks and 60 milestones. There was 1 culminating task for each goal path, plus there was an additional culminating task for skills training. And as we know, skills training is considered part of the apprenticeship goal path. When the milestones were initially developed, there was at least 1 milestone for each indicator in the Ontario Adult Literacy Curriculum Framework. Some of the indicators did have more than 1 milestone, and that was to make sure that all 5 of those goal paths were represented. So if you're familiar with milestones, a milestone might actually have applicability to more than 1 goal path, but not necessarily all 5 of the goal paths. So they're kind of associated with whatever it makes the most sense that they go with. So that's not a rule. It's just a guideline for practitioners. So they have a good understanding of which milestones actually support which of the goal paths. So the development of the milestones and the culminating tasks was one of the very last stages in terms of the original Ontario Adult Literacy Curriculum Framework project, which was the big project where the framework itself was developed, as well as all the supporting documentation and tools. So the last stage of this was really developing these more, I'll use the term loosely, but standardized assessment tools and some of which the milestones that are linked to performance management. In 2014, there was some additional work that happened around the tools. So at that point, 12 additional culminating tasks were developed, which was great because in the initial rollout, there were only 6. So that was a fairly limited range of culminating tasks to choose from. And not all of them had applicability to every learner. In fact, many learners weren't able to complete culminating tasks because they just didn't make sense. They were too specific to certain goal paths or specific goals on goal paths. So in addition, or within that 12, 2 new culminating tasks were developed for each of the 5 goal paths, and then another 2 were developed for that skills training component of the apprenticeship goal path. Also in 2014, 22 milestones were adapted, and those adapted versions were also made available to the field. So between 2014 and last year, there was no work on developing or revising or doing any work around the culminating tasks and milestones. So that was the group of tools that we had worked with since 2014. From November 2021 to March 2022, so in the last fiscal year, support organizations from across the province worked together and they developed 30 new milestones and 33 new culminating tasks. So it was a pretty monumental project and a lot of new tools were developed. In fact, the number of tools that were developed exceeded the target from the ministry. So the original target was 26 milestones and 33 culminating tasks. So they actually got a few more tools for the investment that they put in, which was fantastic. The tools were developed for each of the 6 competencies and across the 5 different goal paths. With respect to the milestones, the development focus was for the streams to have the opportunity to develop culturally relevant tools. Lower level or no level tools were also an emphasis of that part of the project. However, all the competencies and levels were actually included in the project. With respect to the culminating task development, the focus was really on employment and apprenticeship, but the other goal paths were also included. So many of the support organizations that worked on the project reached out to service delivery agencies to help with this development process. And I'm just wondering, make sure see if you're listening and just ask, is there anybody in the webinar today that participated in the development last year of those milestones or culminating tasks? Maybe just a quick show of hands. I see quite a few. Okay, a few. Oh, lots of people. So quite a few of you were part of the process. And I think that was an important that was important to the process, was to try to include the field as much as possible and to be able to develop things that the field knew that we really needed to be able to make sure that the tools could be used by a wider range of learners across the different goal paths. So the next few minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're calling a milestone refresher. It's really going to be a quick refresher of what milestones are and how they are integrated into the Literacy and Basic Skills program. I know a lot of you are seasoned LBS practitioners, and that just the show of hands showed me lots of you worked on developing milestones. But we also recognize that there's been a significant amount of turnover in the field over the last 10 years, and many practitioners would not have had access to the original training. So we thought it would be useful within this webinar, within the scope of what we're doing today, just to walk people through a refresher of what milestones are and how they're integrated into the Literacy and Basic Skills program. So what is a milestone anyways? It's meant to be goal related. So it's linked to the learner's goal, assessment activity that learners complete to demonstrate their ability to carry out goal related tasks. Important concept, milestones are task based. So the concept of a milestone is that it's something that the learner does that they would do when they left the program, as much as you can do that with an in-class assessment. The milestones are aligned to the 6 competencies and 3 complexity levels that are found in the OALCF curriculum framework. So what they're meant to be is standard indicators of learner progress as they move towards the completion of the goal path they're on. Milestones should really just help practitioners answer the question, can learners apply the skills that they're developing to purposeful or real life tasks? So this definition comes from the service provider guidelines, and they can be found on the Employment Ontario Partner Gateway. The last major update to those guidelines was in 2020. So I always encourage people to make sure that they are looking at the most current version of the service provider guidelines. Don't print them, go online and look at them, because they have updated them a few times over the years. So these are just a couple of quotes that were pulled from another document, and that can also be found on the Employment Ontario Partner Gateway. This is from the Practitioner Guide to Task-Based Programming. So this is one of the original support documents developed when the Ontario Adult Literacy Curriculum Framework was initially rolled out in 2012. So all of those support documents are still available on the Employment Ontario Partners Gateway. And again, for practitioners who are newer, it's important to go back and maybe take a look at those documents, because it really gives you a lot of information about how the OALCF was developed and what all the different pieces are of that system. So in terms of milestones, the idea is that learners only complete milestones that relate to their goal or goals for attending the Literacy and Basic Skills program. It's important to note that successfully completing a selected milestone doesn't mean that the learner can do other tasks at the same level or within the same task group, or that they're ready for transition. So these are really just small incremental assessments to show that a learner is making progress. But they're just one indicator of progress. They're not intended to stand alone. Milestone results aren't meant to be used in isolation to determine whether or not a learner's transition ready. They should complement all the other assessment methods that are used to monitor learner progress. So they're really associated with that whole ongoing assessment practice, but they're only meant to be one component of that. So practitioners and learners should really work together to figure out the milestones that represent the types of tasks learners will need to do once they leave the LBS program and move on to their next step. There are milestones for all 6 competencies, which I've mentioned, and across all 3 of the OALCF complexity levels. As milestone levels increase, the complexity of the tasks asked of the learners also increase. So as learners perform more increasingly complex tasks, they can do things like apply background knowledge and experience to carry out things that aren't familiar to them, manage tasks with unfamiliar elements, find, integrate, and analyze information, and maybe experiment and problem solve to achieve the desired results. So that's just a quick snapshot of what a milestone is. But what about an adapted milestone? So as I mentioned, in 2014, 22 of the original 60 milestones were adapted. So these adaptations were made primarily to allow learners who had limited reading skills show progress by completing milestones that weren't actually assessing the reading skills specifically. So the adaptations, for the most part, allow a practitioner to provide additional support to the learner by maybe reading the instructions for the task to them. So it allows the learners to still complete a task and be assessed without having to actually read more complex instructions. So all of those adapted versions in the milestone index are indicated with an A beside them. So there's an A beside the milestone number in the milestone file name. So it's the same milestone as the corresponding one with the same number, but it has adapted instructions in it to allow somebody that doesn't have the reading skills to read those instructions to still be able to complete it. So I always like to bring everybody's attention to the adaptive milestones because the launch that happened with them was what I would call soft. So a lot of practitioners aren't even aware that they exist. And this is just a table that shows you the 22 milestones with an adapted version. You'll notice that most of the milestones with an adapted version are level 1 milestones, which makes sense. Some of the higher level milestones that are adapted are associated with the task groups that are most closely related to what I would think of or call soft skills, such as creativity, self-management, and working with others. But it is important to know that they exist and that they're part of that original set of milestones that we have available. So another important thing about milestones is that they are part of the performance management system in literacy and basic skills. So they comprise part of the effectiveness dimension. And the target is to have at least 60% of the learners attaining at least one milestone. So if you aren't currently meeting this target, you can ask the following questions. Are there processes in place to ensure learners and practitioners understand the expectations around the completion of milestones? So is it clear that do the learners understand that they need to complete milestones? Do the practitioners understand that this is important in terms of performance management? When the milestones are completed, are they updated in CAMS in a timely fashion? Do you check to make sure all the milestones have been entered prior to closing a service plan in CAMS? have practitioners had adequate training related to the administration of milestones? And that's an important one because as new practitioners come in to the literacy and basic skills program, it's important to make sure that they're aware of all the components and understand what milestones are, what their purpose is, and how to administer them. Do instructors have easy yet secure access to milestones? Also important. The milestones are all kept in what is called the milestone it's called the repository, and Contact North hosts that site. It is a password protected site, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about accessing that site at the end of the presentation. So is there at least one milestone related to the learner goal path identified on each learner plan? Very important. As the learner plan's developed, it's really important to identify at least one milestone, if not more, depending on the learner's goal and the intensity of the programming on their learner plan. Are the completed milestones stored in the learner file? And is there a process in place to make sure completed milestones are recorded in CAMS? Now, again, most of you are seasoned practitioners, and I'm sure you do all of this, but I just think it's important to refresh and remember, and for those that are newer, to really think through the process of that and the importance of milestones because they are tied into the performance management system. In terms of preparing learners for milestones, it's important to discuss the purpose of ongoing assessment with learners and how it can help them reach their goals. So anecdotally, in one of my LBS jobs, I actually work in a program, and we find that learners actually enjoy doing the milestones because we present them in a way that makes them more palatable. We present them in a way that they're not tests, they're just ways for learners to show that they're making progress towards their goal. And in fact, sometimes we have learners ask for milestones, like when am I going to get to do another milestone? So I think a lot of it is how it's introduced and discussed with the client. In terms of also preparing them, learners should really work on activities that are connected to the milestone they're going to be completing, or vice versa. You should be choosing a milestone that actually supports the things the learner needs to be doing in the program. And that hopefully will be even easier to do when you can access all the new milestones because you will have a wider range to choose from. And they should also be successful at this type of thing before they attempt a milestone. So again, a learner should never really attempt a milestone unless you're pretty confident that they're going to be successful on completing it. Having learners complete other assessment activities that are from the same task group and level, that would make sense because you're choosing milestones that relate to what you're having the learner work on that is actually related to their goals. And again, just stressing making sure the learner is ready to complete an assessment. And also, if they don't complete a milestone successfully, they can redo a milestone. So there are guidelines around that, the time that you should wait in between administering the same milestone. But if someone doesn't complete it successfully, that's actually okay. They can try to do it again. So back when we used to do the big milestone and culminating tasks training at the beginning of the rollout of the OALCF, one of the big questions that always came up was how many milestones? And I think it's still an important question to address because while there's no set number of milestones that must be chosen, the expected amount of time the learner plans to spend in your program and the intensity of what they're doing can be or help you determine how many milestones you and the learner should select to show progress. So it's really advantageous for learners to have milestones across the range of competencies and task groups that reflect or relate to their needs and goals. It's really just meant to be an opportunity to demonstrate or show what's been learned, but they should be 100% confident about attempting it. So again, I'll just stress that the addition of the 30 new milestones will mean that there's a much better variety of milestones to choose from. And I think that will make the process a little easier if you have a wider variety to choose from. So over the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through the process that was used to develop the new milestones and actually tell you a little bit about what was actually developed. So this table just gives you a snapshot of who did what in the fast and furious development that happened in the last fiscal year. So the stream and sector organizations were asked to develop milestones, and they were distributed by the ministry according to expertise and relevant levels. So for example, Community Literacy of Ontario focused on level 1 milestones, CESBA on level 2 milestones, and the College Sector Committee on level 3 milestones. That's not to say that everybody in a community-based program only does level 1 milestones, but the idea was that those different organizations probably had more expertise within the levels that they were assigned. The Ontario Native Literacy Coalition was able to decide which levels were most needed in terms of adding more culturally relevant milestones to support their stream. Center Flora and COPA were asked to develop 6 milestones each, with a focus on what the Francophone stream needed the most to support programming. So again, they were kind of given the ability to pick and choose what made the most sense for their streams. Those two organizations, because they were developing French milestones, worked really closely together because they wanted to make sure that they avoided duplication and covered as much as they could. Labec Literacy Ontario, which is my organization, we developed the guidelines and processes. We organized training for all of those involved in the development, and we coordinated the work of all the different organizations to try to avoid duplication and just keep the project moving. Contact North played a supporting role throughout the process and did the logistical work of getting the tools desktop published, for example, and also on the repository or available on the repository by March 30th, 2020. So the new milestones were developed for each competency. New milestones are meant to complement or supplement the original milestones, not replace them. And what I'm going to do next is just take a look at what was developed for each of the competencies. It's going to take a look in the chat. I don't see any questions. Again, if you have any questions as we're going through this, feel free to put them in the chat and we will be happy to pause probably and answer them. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about find and use information. 7 new milestones were developed for this competency. 5 were developed in English and 2 were developed in French. So it's important to know that all of the English milestones are going to be translated into French, and all of the French milestones will be translated into English. This work is actually currently underway in this fiscal year. So that work isn't done yet, but it is underway. You might know, or you will probably notice that the new milestones, they're highlighted in yellow, start at number 201 for English and 301 for French. This had to be done to allow them to be integrated with current milestones on CAMS and grouped with appropriate competencies and levels without having to renumber all the milestones. So we didn't want to renumber them all again because a lot of people who have been around for a long time actually probably have all the current milestone numbers memorized. I know I have a lot of them memorized myself. When you go to when we get to the repository section of the webinar, you'll be able to see a little clearly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about integrating them into the correct competency and level. In terms of communicate ideas and information, there were 6 developed in English and 3 developed in French. So what's interesting about some of these is many of them are what I would call more open-ended than some of the earlier milestones, which will give practitioners a little more choice to be able to meet the specific needs of learners. So one of the concepts we tried to build into the new development process was to think about it from the perspective of giving practitioners who have a lot of experience and expertise, where possible, the ability to make some choices without affecting the complexity of the level that you're actually assessing. So we encouraged the different organizations to really try to build in a little bit of what I think it would be called flexibility into some of the milestones, because that just gives practitioners the ability to, I think, meet the needs of more learners. For understand and use numbers, again, 6 new milestones were developed. 4 were developed in English and 2 in French, and they will be cross-translated. Okay, and use digital technology. Again, 6 milestones were developed, 3 in English and 3 in French. What's interesting is that we didn't specify when we were working on what we would develop. It wasn't specified what competencies people would work on. It was more around levels. And what was interesting is we got a really good, I would say, a really good spread across these 4 competencies in terms of the numbers were developed. And that happened quite organically. But we were really trying to also coordinate through the entire process. With respect to managed learning, there was only one developed, and it was developed in French, but again, that will be translated to English. And the same for engage with others. So again, that was developed in French, and it will be translated into English. So I'm going to just take a pause for a second because I noticed that there's quite a bit of comments in the chat, and I just want to make sure that we've addressed people's questions. So I know Barb is monitoring this and trying to answer. Okay, so there was a comment about how many milestones are required or ideal for a learner to achieve. And Barb answered 1 successful milestone is required to meet the performance measure. And there is no ideal number. It depends on the learner's plan, type of activities they are working on, and of course, what their goal is. And somebody commented that when they started, they were told to make it a goal to have a learner complete a milestone every 3 months. So I'm just scrolling through to make sure the questions have been answered. Okay. And then, so I think with that, it's really your goal. I mean, you want to have learners complete a milestone because it does count towards performance management if it makes sense. But remember that that target is only 60%. But you want to choose the appropriate amount for the learner's goal and the intensity of the programming. I mean, if they're only coming to your programming a couple times a week for a couple of hours, it might not be reasonable that they're making enough progress to complete a milestone every month or every 3 months. So it's really about how often they're there, what their goal is, what milestones are available to support that goal. So those choices will really be learner specific. And the beauty of the LBS program is that we're able to develop programming that is learner centered and very goal oriented. So we can kind of choose what makes the most sense. There was another question in here about the milestones not being available in CAMS yet, and that is correct. They are not available yet, and we will talk about that at the end of the webinar. Okay. So new milestones, what about the adapted versions? So there aren't adapted versions of the new milestones, but as I mentioned, when organizations were working through this process on the new milestones, they were asked to do it with that whole concept of adaptation in mind and to include adaptations within the actual milestones where possible. So this is something we did ask people to consider, but instead of having 2 versions to build it into the original or new version that they were working on. So in summary, we now have 112 milestones. There were 60 original milestones, 22 adapted milestones, which were done in 2014. And then in 2022, 30 new milestones were added. So it was a significant amount of tools added to this toolkit for practitioners. Some people have asked, will there be more developed? It's possible, and we thought about that as we were doing things like developing a new numbering system, so that if we had an opportunity to develop more in the future, we could actually integrate more into the current system. One of the things that is happening in the current fiscal year is that Deaf Literacy Initiative does have a project to develop some milestones to specifically support the deaf stream, which is really exciting for them. So they have a dedicated project on that. I'm not 100% sure how many they're developing, but they are working on that right now. So before we leave milestones, I'll just give you one more chance if you have any questions. And I don't think I see any more in here. So I'm going to turn it over to Barb now, and she's going to talk about culminating tasks.
Great. Thank you very much, Robin. Thanks for the great overview of the milestones, both old and new. And thank you also to everybody for the good questions in the chat. So Robin and I will kind of switch roles here, and she can also keep an eye on the chat as I'm talking. Oh, and Robin's controlling the slide deck, so we're just doing a transition here. That's okay. We're good now. And then I'm also transitioning on my own screen. So what you've probably noticed in some of the documentation and information that Robin has provided is that a lot of it is from the existing documents that were created way back in the beginning of the OALCF, sort of in the 2012 timeline, a few updates to the milestones in 2014 with the adapted versions, and continuing into our discussion of culminating tasks. A lot of the things that we're presenting here are directly from the ministry documentation. However, as Robin also said, not a lot of updates have been made over the years to any of the documentation. So it's getting a little rusty, some of it, but at least now we have some new culminating tasks and milestones to work with when they are fully translated and released by the ministry, likely early in the new fiscal year, early in 2023-24. So ministry's definition, a culminating task is more complex than a milestone. It's, of course, also aligned to the OALCF, and it reflects some kind of a task that a learner could expect to perform when they exit the LBS program. It loosely answers the question, can the learner manage the expectations of either learning, training, community, or the work setting after leaving the LBS program? It doesn't prove it, and it's not an all or nothing. It's an indicator of a student's ability to manage the expectations of the next step as they transition out of the program. So, features of a culminating task. It is a complex task, of course, as we mentioned before. It involves several, or at least 2 or 3 competencies and task groups within the OALCF. So it might incorporate both, say, find and use information and numeracy. Maybe it would also have some communicate ideas and information in there. So the idea is, unlike the milestones that are focused on a particular competency and a particular task group, the culminating tasks are focusing on or including more than one competency and task group. Ideally, the culminating tasks are allowing our learners to show that they can apply their skills in a real life task that is a little more complex than a milestone, but also representing something that they might come across when they leave us and transition into their goal destination. So it's also, that last point is really important, that a culminating task is meant to represent the end of a goal path, someone that is, and the ministry uses this phrase a lot in their documentation, transition ready, no matter what the goal path is they're on. Not all learners will get to the point of attempting and completing a culminating task, and that is totally fine. We have many other indicators of progress and success for LBS learners. The culminating task is one of them for those who ostensibly make it to the end of their goal path and are in a position to attempt a culminating task. And if you do any CAMS data entry, you will know that when you record a culminating task in CAMS, there are 3 options in the answer to the question, did the learner successfully complete a culminating task? There's yes, no, and no response. So the no response is really meant to indicate those files that are learners that are exiting who are not in a position yet to complete a culminating task. So that's why the no response is there. Another really important point about culminating tasks is that they do not replace any other kind of credential, course, certification, micro-credential, anything that a learner might need to get into their goal destination. So it's not something that's recognized or used at all outside of LBS. It's simply something that that we have in LBS to help establish our learners' readiness to transition to the next goal path. Other credentials or courses might include things like first aid CPR if a student needs that for work or perhaps to go on to further training. Certainly admission requirements for post-secondary courses. They don't have anything to do with culminating tasks. So there's lots of things that our learners have to do to be transition ready. And this is just one thing that is internal to LBS. I see a question in the chat. Is it necessary for a learner to complete a culminating task? Oh, and Robin's answering, so I'll just, yeah. So Robin has addressed that a learner would typically only complete a culminating task if they've completed everything else they need to directly transition into their goal. So if they're on the employment goal path and they've completed all of the learning activities, milestones, other pieces of the programming that you might be giving them, and they're ready to exit to employment, then ostensibly they could complete a culminating task. But if they haven't completed everything they've set out to do, or that they need to make that transition, then no, it wouldn't make sense for them to do their culminating task. And that's, as I said, partly where the no response answer in CAMS comes into play. We know, because we've been working in LBS for a long time, that there's lots of other things other than just culminating tasks that will help to indicate that someone is ready to transition out of LBS and into their goal destination. So as we mentioned a few minutes ago, it might be completion of required academic courses or credentials, might be industry required credentials, like, as I said, CPR, first aid, Smart Serve, any of those. But aside completely from activities and milestones and culminating tasks, we also know very clearly that the stability of a learner's personal life has an enormous amount to do with whether they're actually ready and able to transition from us into the next step of their life learning or work. We always in LBS have it's kind of been a cornerstone of LBS to use a variety of different assessment tools and measures, and that is no different. Milestones and culminating tasks just happen to be 2 of the ones that were that are involved with both our performance management and with our task-based programming in the OALCF. But there are many other assessment tools, tests, quizzes, activities, all kinds of other things that we use ongoing with our learners, and that's really important that we continue to do that and that we always do that. I'll just go back to the employment example for a minute. We also understand that even within the same goal path, learners can have very different activities and different milestones. So for example, again, I'll just use the example of the employment path. If a learner is preparing to exit and go into construction laboring or some kind of an entry-level trade laborer position, then the activities and milestones that are selected for that learner might look quite different than somebody going into, say, retail sales or going into hospitality, something like that. So it's expected that learners on the same goal path might not necessarily all complete the same milestones. And now that we have a few more culminating tasks to choose from, as we'll talk about in the next few slides, it makes it a little bit easier for us to choose a culminating task that's more closely related to the learner's goal. Another example, in the post-secondary path, the requirements on the learner plan for someone who's preparing to enter, say, a business accounting program would be quite different than someone who's on the post-secondary goal path to prepare to enter practical nursing. But all of that is saying that milestones and culminating tasks are two examples of assessment tools, but we have many, many others that we need to use to both establish transition readiness and to help our learners progress and learn as they go along with us. A lot of the culminating tasks, well, not necessarily a lot, some do have more of a connection to self-management than to actual vocational skills or academic skills, which is quite fine, because we know that learners in our program often need to develop their self-management and self-direction skills. And so it makes sense that the culminating tasks in some cases have a component or focus a little bit more on the demands of the goal destination rather than on the content and knowledge requirements of the goal destination. So just to kind of paraphrase the very first slide we looked at, this is also a quote from one of the ministry documents. Doing a culminating task helps the learner answer this question. Do I have a reasonable chance, remember, it's only one indicator, of managing the next step in my life, learning, or work, and can I transition successfully to my goal destination? It's not the only thing, but it's one thing. And then in the little red box there again, just saying it in another way, probably the third or fourth time we've kind of alluded to this so far in our discussion of culminating tasks, that the culminating task is one way for learners to demonstrate they may be ready to transition to one of the goal paths. And you know what? They may not, quote, pass the culminating task and still be ready to transition. So it's not that we're trying to put all our eggs in one basket. The culminating task is one indicator. With the addition of the new culminating tasks, there'll be actually a total of 51 to choose from instead of the original 18. So that's pretty exciting. And just to summarize a little bit, this graphic is really a continuum of the day-to-day programming that we provide for our learners. We have activities that we work through, assignments, whatever they may be, task-based activities. Integrated tasks are a little more complex. We have milestones that we give them at intervals to help demonstrate their progress. And then if they get to the end point of their goal path and are ready to transition into their goal destination, then we may give them a culminating task. At the same time that someone is going through all of these different kind of pieces of the LBS program, they may also be getting credentials or courses or whatever else it is that they need to get from us to their next destination. And of course, as much as possible, we're outlining all of these different kinds of learning activities and tasks and milestones in their learner plans. And in terms of relationship to milestones, again, you could almost think of successfully completing a variety of milestones is helping learners to demonstrate that they have the skills and knowledge that are relevant to their goal, and also demonstrating that they perhaps have the skills and abilities to complete that culminating task, which of course is a combination of multiple competencies and levels. Milestones are used during the learner's time in our program, and culminating task is used potentially, possibly at the end if it's appropriate. This is kind of an, I'm going to use the word old resource, but it's still, I think, relevant, and is just an example of a tool that was developed to help track task-based assessment and milestone and culminating task completion. I'll I'm just going to do one thing here. I'm going to, because I have my live version going, I'm going to type this link into the chat, just in case it happens that you want to take a look at that, since you can't click on your screen and access it. Okay. There. So I just put that link into the chat that you can currently see on the screen if you were interested in looking at this or using it or downloading it and modifying it. All right, the moment we've all been waiting for. We're going to talk a little bit about the new culminating tasks now that we've done a review of the oldies but goodies. Similar in format to how Robin described the milestone development to you. I'll walk you also through the, sorry, I just have to get my own presentation back up to date here. 1 second. There we go. So similar to the format that Robin used to walk you through the milestones, I'll similarly walk you through how the development was undertaken, so you have a bit of context for who was doing what with the culminating tasks. So all of the organizations listed on the left-hand side, which are in this case, the regional networks, were contracted to develop 2 culminating tasks for employment, apprenticeship or skills training. And I'm sure you'll recognize your own network in there. Simcoe Muskoka, slightly different. They would develop 1. And sorry, I still have a bit of a post-COVID throat, so I have to pause just for a second, take a drink of water. I've been saying I have a post-COVID throat for about 2 months now, and I hope one day I don't have to say that anymore. So in their development, the regional networks were asked to develop those 2 culminating tasks with reference to their own local labor market needs. So for example, if manufacturing is an industry in that literacy networks area that is prominent and has a fair bit of hiring and so on, then it would have made sense for them to do culminating tasks that might have related to manufacturing. If there was a lot of service industry, so you think about some of the very tourist oriented areas of the province, then it might have made sense to do culminating tasks that have to do with the tourist industry. So that's what we mean by that having the networks were, oh, thanks, Sophie. I see your comment in the chat. And I actually feel quite fine. I just have this weird throat thing going on still and a bit of a tickle, especially obviously when I talk too much. So thank you, Sophie. So yes, if it's a region of the province with a lot of tourism, that network might have chosen to do something in the service or hospitality sector related to their culminating task development. In addition, the sectoral support organizations, including the CSC, my organization, were contracted to develop 1 specific culminating task. And that was normally related to obviously the goal path that many of their learners would be on. So in the colleges, for the college sector committee, we developed 1 new culminating task for the post-secondary path. Community literacy developed a new one for the independence path. KESBA developed 1 for credit, secondary school credit. And Contact North had the responsibility of helping with some of the desktop publishing and finalizing and technical work. And so it was a very collegial effort. I also worked with Robin and LLO a little bit on some of the training for the developers who were involved. So we really did have a lot of involvement and coordination through this project, even though, as Robin has alluded to, it was very short and there was a lot of time pressure to get these things done. Thanks, Heather. That's a great example that you put in the chat. Quill, the network that Heather manages, did a culminating task for Carpenter and 1 for shipper receiver. So we'll just take a look now at the titles of some of the new culminating tasks to give you a preview, even though we can't use them yet. So at the bottom, you can see the old culminating tasks that were originally there. And we've just tried to group these somewhat if we can, but not necessarily. So construction craft worker, ECE, early childhood educator, carpenter. That must be the one that you probably did, Heather. Preparing for the certificate of qualification exam. That's the exam at the end of the very, very end of an apprentice's training. After 3 or 4 or 5 years as an apprentice, they have to write the CFQ exam if they wish to actually be a certified apprentice or a certified journey person. I want on heavy equipment tech. And on the next page, we have a few more. So there you can see the titles of some of them in the skills training category, which of course is a subcategory of apprenticeship. Certificate training, personal support worker, hairstyling, and forestry. Some pretty interesting ones there, in addition to the old ones. And it's not to say the old ones aren't still usable or good, but now we just have many more to choose from. And the big one, of course, was the employment culminating task development. And I won't read through all those, but you can certainly, we'll leave them up the slide there up just for a moment, and you can sort of skim through them and see some that might be of interest to you. Really quite a nice variety there when you look at them. And when you look at those, you can probably see what I was, or recognize what I was saying before, where some of the culminating tasks for employment especially are related to industries in particular parts of the province where they might be in demand. So winery assistant, Niagara region pretty much, or maybe the Prince Edward County region. Personal support worker or home support worker everywhere in the province. In terms of the employment culminating tasks, they didn't fit on the other screen. These were the 3 older culminating tasks that are currently still available and still usable, and then will be complemented by all of the new ones. Just looking back at the chat, don't see anything there. Independence, the 3 old ones were listed on the bottom. The new one relates to information on a medicine product label, which again makes sense for the independence goal path, because that's something that certainly is really important for people to be able to do, all of us to be able to do. For the secondary school credit goal path, the new one is entitled Growth Mindset, which, and remember I said earlier that some of the culminating tasks relate more to the self-management side of our learners' growth and learning. So this is a good example of one that is not academic, even though it's on a secondary school credit goal path, but it's more focusing on lifelong learning and growing as an individual. For the post-secondary goal path, we have a new one that is related specifically to post-secondary admission and completing courses that are admission requirements to get into college or university. And so that complements the 3 existing ones that were a little more related to specific areas, perhaps, of post-secondary study. Don't see anything back in the chat yet. So I think with that, I will conclude my comments on culminating tasks if there are no questions at this point. And I don't see any in the chat. If you think of something around a culminating task and you'd like to ask it, just pop it into the chat anytime. And with that, I will turn things back over to Robin for the last portion of the session today.
Barb, that was a great overview of culminating tasks and all the new tasks that are, or culminatings that are available. I'm particularly excited because I also work in a program, and just having all those new culminating tasks mean that we're actually going to have more that makes sense for learners. It's always been a challenge, and I think across the province, it's been a pretty significant challenge because we were so limited in what we had available. So this isn't going to solve all the problems or mean that there's a culminating available for everybody, but at least there's a lot more to choose from. Sue just commented, we might be able to have learners complete one. And I feel the same way too, because in our program, we might actually have a lot more opportunities for learners to be able to complete them. So the next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is the repository. And again, if you've been around for a long time, I'm sure you know about the repository, but I wanted to make sure that everybody is aware of it. I'm just going to walk you through where all the milestones and culminating tasks are housed and how they can be accessed by LBS practitioners. So there is a bit of a process. You need to actually have access to the repository. It's password protected. And it is maintained by Contact North. If you don't currently have access, you can request it by contacting Sarah, and her information is on this slide. When you go to the repository, this will pop up if you don't have access. She will confirm with your organization that you should have access before she actually lets you set up an account. So through the years, a lot of this kind of got lost in translation. So it's an opportunity for us just to remind people that they're all there, and it's always best to work with the ones that are online and download those in case they have been updated. Anastasia asked, is that access for instructors or just administrators? And that is really a decision that your organization will make, Anastasia. So some organizations allow their instructors to get an account, and others, I guess it depends on how you're administering milestones and how that process works. So it's definitely up to your organization, and that's why Sarah will confirm with your organization that you should have access. So when you open the portal, this is the top of the page, and everything's accessed off of one page, which is kind of nice. So you just have to scroll down and keep scrolling down to find the information you're looking for. You can also toggle between French and English. So there's a link at the top of the page, and there's also a link at the bottom of the page. You can scroll down to find the information. And at the top or the bottom. Currently, all the old milestones and culminating tasks are available in both French and English. So if you toggle to French, they'll be listed there for you in French. And if you toggle to English, they'll be listed in English. As I mentioned, the new tools have not yet been translated. They are currently being translated in this fiscal year. So I anticipate that they'll be uploaded to the repository probably at the end of this fiscal year. So they're available for 2023, 2024. The guides and indexes for both the milestones and culminating tasks have also not yet been updated. So this was not scheduled as part of the initiative work last year, but it is being completed in the current fiscal year. So again, those guides and indexes only reflect the old tools, but they are being updated this year, and then will reflect the whole range of tools that will be available in the next fiscal year. So as you scroll down, you'll see the milestones first, and they're organized by competency. Remember, the new milestones are there, so you can see them, but the user guide and index hasn't been updated. So I'll just show you what it looks like when you open Find and Use Information. All the milestones are listed by task group, and then in order of the level. So you'll see here, there's milestone 1, and then there's milestone 1A. So that's the adapted version of milestone 1. Same with 2, 2A. And as you scroll down, you go from 4 to 201. And again, this is if it starts with a 2 or a 3, 200 or 300, that means it's one of the new tools. And we had to renumber them for many different logistical reasons, which I won't get into on this webinar. The most important of which was to not have to renumber the entire original set of milestones. Okay, so originals, the original milestones will say March 2012 at the end of the file name. The adapted will say March 2014. Sometimes there's an occasional 2016 in there for something that's been updated at a certain point. And then the new milestones will say March 2022. Again, as you scroll down further, then you get to the section where all the culminating tasks are listed, and they are organized by those 5 goal paths. So the indexes and the guides haven't been updated yet, will be this year, but all the new tools have been uploaded. Apprenticeship includes both apprenticeship and the skills training or culminating tasks, sorry. So I'll just show you what it looks like if you were to open up the apprenticeship listing. So these files are not labeled with a date, and they're all descriptive. So they give you a description of what the culminating task is about. For each culminating task, you have both the learner's version and the practitioner version. So the practitioner version is essentially the instructions for the practitioner. The learner's version is the version that the learner works with to actually complete the culminating task. So we use the same format. All the old ones and new ones basically use that same format. They have 2 separate documents. And when you look at the new ones, you will notice that what we tried to do was keep them as consistent as possible with the original set. And the same is true with milestones. Okay. So that just gives you a bit of an overview of the repository. There's been some discussion in the chat about who can access them. And Sarah's given some information about typically who is the person who can access them. So if you want a little more information about that, you can check the chat. And also, if you need access, again, you can send an email to Sarah. Okay. So before we wrap it up, I'm just going to bring us back around to some of the original training that we did when this initially rolled out many, many years ago, and just do a really brief summary on some best practices around. Oops, sorry, I flipped my screen by accident. And my apologies. So just some general tips for integrating assessment. Make sure that you're introducing assessment tools and expectations at intake. Review resources that are available to increase learner success. So there's lots of resources out there. The task-based activities website is a great place to go for resources that align with the OALCF and support all the different goal paths. There's lots of assessment resources available in general that support the OALCF. Using or introducing learning activities that use similar formatting, layout, spacing, font type, font size, wording, etc. So learners are familiar with that type of a tool when they have to work with it. Mapping your assessment activities and ongoing learning activities to competencies, task groups, and levels associated with an appropriate culminating task. Integrating your assessment activities in addition to milestones throughout the program delivery period. So remember, again, milestones are just one little snapshot of learner progress, part of ongoing assessment, but you have a whole range of assessment practice that you use in a program. And presenting the learning plan with milestones and a culminating task included, so the learner understands what is expected. I'm going to go backwards because I messed up and went forwards twice. Another good resource I just wanted to bring your attention to, it's an oldie, a real oldie, but a goldie, I would say, is the Western Region Best Practice Champion interviews. And there's 2 different groups, one on learner progress and one on completions. This gives you some information, helpful tips, and there's also a transcript of those webinars that took place. So if you're looking for more information and tips and tricks and just things from seasoned practitioners, this is a great resource that's still available. So what's going to happen next? The question of the hour is always, can we use them? Are we able to use them? So on September 20th of this current year, MLITSD did send out some official messaging around the use of milestones. And what's interesting about this is it seems that not everybody received the messaging. Some programs and organizations did in certain parts of the province, and in other parts they didn't. So we just thought we'd share this in the webinar because it was sent out as an official ministry email to some people. And what's the important thing to take from this is that the integration of the newly developed tools will not occur in CAMS until the next fiscal year. So the milestones will not be integrated into CAMS in this current fiscal year, because if you're familiar with CAMS and data entry, you actually have to choose the milestone. In terms of the culminating task, because it's just a ticky box in CAMS, they don't have to integrate all the different culminating tasks, but they have directed that they not be used in this current year as well. Part of the issue, or a big part of the issue, is that none of the resources are available in both official languages yet. So that translation needs to take place before everybody is able to access them equitably. So that's one of the reasons why they're not available, or not, they are available, but you can't use them yet. So they're advising that service providers do not use new milestones and culminating tasks until you receive direction from the ministry to do so. If you do it, you won't receive any credit in towards your SQS score for milestones. If you have used or use one of the new milestones or culminating tasks, there's no method to record this in CAMS, or even if you do with the culminating, it supposedly doesn't count. So I guess that my advice to you is just hold off on using them until we've received direction that they're okay for us to go ahead with this. However, in the meantime, you do have the opportunity to familiarize yourself with all the tools because they have been made available on the repository. Future planned work includes the translation of the new English tools into French and French into English. In addition, and that's not on this slide because it's when we first developed this, we didn't know this, there are new milestones being developed currently by Deaf Literacy Initiative to support the deaf stream. There is a review of the original assessment, the milestones and culminating tasks, to identify and correct errors and add options to maintain or enhance the relevance of milestones. So that is a project that's happening in the current fiscal year. Essentially, all of the original 60 milestones plus 22 adapted milestones and the original 18 culminating tasks are being reviewed. And through that review process, they will be, if possible, modernized in terms of if there's anything out of date in them, any small errors will be corrected, and then they will be reposted, those with the revisions included. So they're not going to be changed or rewritten. They're just going to be, I would say they're going to be just modified or brought into the current times with some small tweaks. Also, the guides and indexes are being reviewed, and they're also going to be updated. And a process for monitoring changes going forward or issues with the new milestones and culminating tasks will be created. So that means there will be some type of a form or reporting system on the repository where if you notice an issue with a culminating task or a milestone, you'll be able to report it, and then it will be able to be corrected, as opposed to just having them there for the next 10 years and never making any small changes or corrections. As Barb and I have both alluded to, the process was very fast and furious. So we do anticipate that there are some small errors and issues with what was posted. And we anticipate having to make some corrections over the next little while. So that will be integrated into the repository probably sometime early in the process is underway. It's just integrating it. So probably early in 2023, that will be there. So those are the kind of the next steps that are happening, or the future planned work for now. So that's it for content for me. And I'm just gonna ask Barb if she had anything else she wanted to add before we move on. There is an evaluation, and I believe it's been posted in the chat a couple times. Maybe we can post the link for the evaluation another time in the chat, as many people are starting to leave because it is getting late in the day. And I'm going to just thank you for your time and attention today, and I'm going to turn it over to Barb for any last comments.
Great. Thank you, Robin, for the great last section talking about the repository and some of the next steps and best practices. Thanks also to everyone for attending today and for taking the time to make some comments, ask some questions. It always makes the webinars more interesting for everyone when there's some chat going on. So we appreciate that as well. If again, just for a little plug for Pop-Up PD, we have January, February, and March, I believe. January and February Pop-Up PDs left to do. And the topics for those are, I can't even remember right now. I know I'm doing one of them. I think it's related to the Skills for Success project. Heather's online with us too, and maybe Heather, you remember the last one that is taking place, or the other one besides the Skills for Success one. But anyway, we also do encourage you to
hybrid learning
PD topics if you'd like. So have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. Thank you to Stacy from Contact North for her technical backup, and for Heather from Quill for supporting us through being a moderator and helping to field some questions in the chat. So, oh yes, Heather, hybrid learning panel is the next webinar. How could I forget that? And then after that, the last one is related to the Skills for Success project. So have a great rest of the week and enjoy the early winter days that we're now having. I look out my window and it's already getting dark here in Northern Ontario. Thanks again, Robin. Always great to work with you as well.
You too. Thank you.